So we started dating while I was still in prison, and people wanted to know, like, how do you have a relationship, especially since we didn't meet in person until the day I got out?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, it started really slow, and it started, as I interviewed him, and then we talked, and it was over such a long period of time. So there was sort of familiarity. But then I think the transition from that into a friendship and then into a romance was built on trust. Like if you said you were going to call, you called, and you did it every day, and so there was a comfort for me that started to build.
Yeah, and it was so funny to me because I remember her asking, she was like, how do people have relationships? Like, that's ridiculous. Like, how do you know if you're in a relationship? Like, you can't have sex. Like, how do you know? I was like, you know. And she was like, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't understand it. I was like, I mean, if you can never touch somebody, what is the difference between a friendship and a romance? And it really is the emotional intimacy. And so, yeah, that built over time, and it really did build. It wasn't over him saying nice things to me or making big promises. It was just consistency, showing up, listening, being interested in what was going on in my life, sharing what was going on in his life, and just these authentic conversations that were really meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I learned in prison is that you can't judge a person by their words, but instead by their actions. And that's really how I look at relationships. Like, obviously, the words, the exchange of words is part of the relationship, but the things people say they're going to do or they say there are, well, I don't trust that. I trust what somebody shows me, or shows himself to be. So, like, when I saw her, I mean, I was attracted to her. Like, I was, had these ideas. I thought she was really smart, but I didn't know who she was. I didn't know that she would show up for me. I didn't know that we would develop a relationship that, yeah, that was based on trust, that I felt comfortable telling her things because I knew she would respect my, kind of my secrets. She would listen to me. She would honor what I had to say, and she would make space for me. And I wasn't used to that. Like, I was used to these kind of mercurial, like, up and down crazy relationships. So when I found somebody that just felt like home, who just felt warm and comfortable, I was like, wow, this is different. Like, this is not what I was expecting.
Yeah, I think that is the strangest thing to me is like you say, it felt like home. It felt so familiar. It felt so comfortable, but not in a boring way, like just in like this like really comforting, intimate, close way, like talking to my best friend or somebody who's already like part of my family or something. And I have not ever felt like that.
And it was two things. I was talking to somebody last night who was having problems in their relationship and asked me, like, well, if you don't have kind of the crazy, like, don't you miss the fun? And I was like, no. And I thought that way for a long time. I thought relationships based on past experience had to be like crazy and up and down, and that was where the passion came from. That's not passion, that's insanity. That's like survival mode. And instead, what I found is someone who is stable and healthy and comfortable, but nothing is lost. In fact, everything is gained because I'm not like constantly trying to cling on for, dear hold.
I remember early on in our conversations, you were like, yeah, like when we fight and then we get to make up. And I was like, I don't know. Like, I'm not a screamer. Like, I don't think we're going to have like screaming fights. Like, I never have. And I just, yeah, I mean, I think that's been like we do have arguments. And I actually think one of the things we probably both have a tendency to do is like retreat emotionally a little bit when we get upset rather than come out. And so that's actually something we both have to work on is like showing up and being like sharing that we're upset or that something hurt
Yeah.
our feelings or that it's uncomfortable, but it doesn't turn into like ugly accusations or like cruel insults flung or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that you should have rules for fighting. Like you had that with your brother when you were a
I
kid.
did.
And I've talked to people about this. So, the guy who's kind of a mentor to me, he said one of the most important things to establish in a relationship is the rules to fight. Like, how do you fight in a relationship? How do you have disagreements? How do you work through them? And so we talked about these things while I was still locked up. When we couldn't be like, physical bodies, where we couldn't have physical interaction, we talked about all the eventualities, how we wanted to fight, how we wanted to relate to each other, how we wanted to spend time, the importance of also having our own lives and our own friendships and our own relationships outside of this. And it was just an amazing thing to do that and then watch it transition into real life. Because I think most of the time we have intentions, but we're not realistic. We're like, oh yeah, we're gonna be great. We're never gonna fight. But instead we're like, all right, we're probably gonna fight. We're probably gonna have days we can't stand each other. We're probably gonna have issues. So how do we deal with those? And how do we make sure that we still show up for each other day by day? And it was the same way as in there. I got up and I called in the morning whether I felt like it or not. I showed up in whatever way I could, whether I felt like it or not. Like whether there was a good day or a bad day, I figured out a way to show up for her. And I guess it kind of helped that you were having a tough time when we first got together, because it gave me something concrete to hold on to. Because I think relationships have to have shared experience. Because if we just had completely separate lives, nothing would be working. And you had one of the best suggestions when we first started. You said,
we need a project. We
yeah,
needed something because we weren't together. We couldn't go out and go to dinner or like, work on something at home together. So that was where the idea, well, I mean, I guess we started to talk about that before there was a romantic relationship, but even just as a friendship, having some kind of shared purpose and having a project, which ended up to be Present, the podcast, was something that we were doing together. It gave us kind of a focus. It was something to talk about other than just like, what did you do this morning? And it was kind of bigger than both of us. And that was really through that process. And we were having other conversations as well. It was that where everything just kind of fell into place.
well, I think that's one of the reasons that relationships do well while people have kids together, because they have that common project. But once the kids are gone, if they haven't made the effort or found a common experience or common thing to work on, they're suddenly just two separate people who have nothing in common anymore. And I think that's one of the things. If you're going to have a relationship, invest in that relationship. Find things like, there are things I could do with Courtney that wouldn't be my first choice of doing. There are things she goes to do with me that wouldn't be her first. She came to my jiu-jitsu tournament. She came to things that I know she does not care in the least about, but because she came to support me. Like, she'll come do things with my mom. I'll go do things with her family. It's not that we don't want to do those things. It's just that we recognize that investing in the other person and the other person's life is the way a relationship works. And we started doing that even early on. I mean, you sent your parents this, these texts and had this conversation about how you were in love with this guy in prison, and it was just perfectly reasonable, and despite all evidence, like, this was going to work out really well.
Yeah. My poor parents. They love him now, and I knew they would, but I also knew there was like nothing I could say that was going to make this seem okay, that it was just like going to have to play out. And there were some incredibly awkward, I mean, in hindsight, humorous moments. And yeah, and in some ways, I'm 50. I felt like a teenager, like trying to convince my parents that my new boyfriend was.
He's great. You're gonna love him. I promise. Even though he drives a bad car and wears a leather jacket, he's a nice guy.
My mom was like, "What about a CPA or somebody just with a normal job? Like, what about just like somebody, nice who's just had a normal life?" And I'm like,
well, and you have to remember, this was when I still had 10 years left on my sentence. So she was not only saying she was in love with me, she was like, I'm going to be with this guy who's in prison for the next decade. Like, it's going to be great.
Yeah, I think my dad at one point, he was like, you're really walking a high wire. And I think they were worried. Actually, he said they were worried about me, but they were also worried about you. Even though, I think they didn't know you at that point, but they're like, this just really could end incredibly badly for both of you.
But ultimately, that's every relationship, right? Like, whether you meet somebody at church or you meet somebody in prison or you meet somebody on the job, like, every relationship has the potential of being amazing or being terrible or just being nothing, just kind of fizzling out. And these steps we take, and you need that base compatibility, obviously, but then the steps you take to make that relationship work or not work are what determines the relationship. So even people inside, I remember you talked, when I got out, you kind of pulled me aside, and this was what I really liked, where you were expressing something. You were like, I really miss our conversations. Like, I don't want you back in prison, but I miss that we had this dedicated time every morning to just talk.
I did. I missed it. There was something lost. Obviously there was way more gained, and I never would have wanted you to go back, but there was this sacred intimacy of just these phone calls where it was this dedicated time. You didn't have a cell phone, but I was on my phone talking to you, so there was no distraction. It was just this intense period of connection, and it's really hard to achieve that when there are a million other things grabbing your attention.
It is, but and the interesting thing, it was definitely intimate and sacred for me, but the environment was so dramatically different. I think we had kind of a different experience. She could be in her house or in her car. I'm surrounded by people. I got guys yelling. I have insanity going on, or I have the milkman coming over to bring me milk. I have weird experiences that weren't necessarily making it or didn't allow it to be quite as intimate or as quiet as I think they did for you.
No, you were definitely not in a good environment, and I was, sitting at home with a latte on my couch.
Yeah.
I think also just maybe slightly switching the subject, I think the thing for me, and I don't know how this necessarily equates to your experience, but I was not looking for a relationship, and I really didn't need a relationship at that point. In fact, I wouldn't say I had said I'll never have a relationship, but I was I had my emotional needs met by my friends. I support myself financially. I was busy with my kids, busy with my career. And so for me, like all the other previous relationships that I'd started or dates I'd gone on, I'm like this has to rise to a certain level to like knock a whole bunch of other things off my list. Like if I'm going to spend time with this person, it means I'm not spending time with my friends or my family. So it had to be something that was like more satisfying to me in some way than doing those things. And so that in a way too, this kind of slow progression where you just kind of like
Frog in boiling water.
yeah, it was like a frog in boiling water where all of a sudden I was like, I would rather talk to him right now than anybody else. And that I think also is where this like deep certainty I had, because it was just how I felt and there was no like right or wrong about it. It was just the truth.
Yeah. And it's funny because I also wasn't looking for a relationship, because I either had 10 years left or this clemency thing was going to come through and I was going to get out. And if I had 10 years left, I didn't want to be in a relationship because it wasn't realistic to expect somebody to wait 10 years. And if I was getting out, well, I had this plan. Like I was going to go out and like run wild and have all this fun and do things. So instead, like I find this woman who is, I don't want to say you're the last thing that I expected, but yeah, when we started talking, I knew I was attracted to you. I knew I liked you, but I had no idea. I was like, this incredibly successful professional woman is not going to want to date me. So like, this is kind of a safe place to like enjoy friendship and intimacy and like have fun. And then it just kept kind of growing. And I was like, I mean, I really like her, but like it would never happen. Like it's what. And then yeah, by the end of that month of talking every day, when you were just like, I'm in love with you. And I was like, I think I am too. Like, but I've known that. Like, this isn't a surprise. It's just, we're finally kind of putting into words. Because for those last couple days, we were like dancing around the fact that
I was hanging up the phone and then saying I love you after.
we essentially turned each other into teenagers. And so that's one of the interesting things.
He asked me in an email, he was like, will you be my girlfriend?
Well, because for me, that is the one area that I never grew up in. Like, I went into prison as a kid, and I grew into a man in all of these other areas, in relationship with other men, in school, in my understanding of the world, but in relationship with a woman, an intimate relationship, I never grew up. So in a way, I was worried. Like, I did all the studying, I did all the work, I worked with a therapist, like, I meditated. I wanted to be prepared, but I was kind of worried, like, I'm going to be a 16-year-old kid, and I'm, like, going to mess this up somehow. But I guess all of that work, like even though the emotional kind of immaturity is there, I'm able to kind of surround that with the intentionality. And I'm able to say like, honey, I'm feeling really crazy right now. Or like, I'm feeling like I can express that to you. And it doesn't mean that the emotion or the discomfort or the frustration or whatever I'm feeling is gone. It just means we have a relationship where I can share that. And I realize I don't have to grow up. Like I don't have to be something or feel something other than what I feel. I just have to find a person with whom I can share all of those things. She can make space for it, and I can make space for whatever she's feeling. And by doing that, we actually allow that to work. And I think it was a lot easier because we started not in person, right? When you start in person, you either get distracted by the lust and you just basically kind of like screw your brains out and don't actually build a relationship, or you like feel really uncomfortable sharing deep, dark things, or like you feel really uncomfortable. But having that distance and having it be over the phone, it feels safer. Like I can tell you anything, and well, if you disappear, well, like I've never met you. Like it'll be okay. Like you didn't like me, but it'll be okay. And at the same time, you could tell me, like, who am I gonna tell? Like you tell me your secrets. I'm some guy in prison. Like what am I gonna tell your mom? Like I don't even know where you live. Like it was bizarre. It was really bizarre.
Yeah, it was, and also it took me a while to break through the fear that every call, is preceded by this call is being recorded. So it's like, really? Like, we're going to talk about, like, really intimate things or, like, secrets, and, like, maybe some third party is just sitting there on the phone, or maybe they play it back, and he was like, no, they can't monitor, every call all the time. But there was always that kind of feeling for me, and I think I finally got to a place where I'm like, literally anything we were talking about, we weren't talking about things that were illegal. We weren't talking about things like, yeah, it would be embarrassing if they played it over a loudspeaker, but it's not bad. It's not wrong. Like anything we talked about, it just personal. So if somebody was eavesdropping, I was like, well, I guess they're having an interesting day.
Yeah. Well, it's two things. I think that situation requires that we learn to verbalize things. Because we just expect people to kind of pick up on cues or signals when we're in person. We're like, you should read the room or read my mind, or these unrealistic things. So we have to learn to verbalize them. But then by doing so, we also recognize we don't have to be ashamed of our insecurities or our desires or our fears or our kinks or whatever it is. We can be who we are, both with the person that we're in love with and also with the world. Like if they don't like it, well, tough. Like they can go somewhere else. They can find somebody else to not like, or you know what I mean? Just realizing that there's a whole sense of freedom that comes from realizing what's going on internally, expressing that with another person, and realizing that if somebody in the prison who has nothing better to do than listen to our phone calls is interested, well, cool. Like, have a good day. Like, I hope this enlightens you as well.
Yeah. I also think it is remarkable that you really are the person that you presented yourself to be. Like, I think the transition from just the phone relationship into real life was made easier by the fact that there really wasn't anything that surprised me, because I really think we'd been so thorough, like overly thorough in the things we talked about. Like, I mean, really obsessively thorough. How do we fight? Like, which side, how do you sleep? What position? Where's your foot? I mean, like, just really specific. So, yeah, I don't feel like there were moments where I was like, that's not what I expected. Like, yeah. I think, there was the jarring nature of like, oh my God, I'm seeing you in 3D, and I really didn't know exactly what you look like. But everything else, I was like, yep, he told me that. Yep, like I knew that. So I think that honesty, authenticity, and being honest with yourself about things, like faults, like what's the most annoying thing about you?
Well, and it's funny the things that like came up and were issues. Like I remember she was like, well, if we're in bed at night, like yeah, we can hug, but then I want you to like get out of my space. And I was hurt. Like I was profoundly hurt. I was like, you don't want to cuddle? Like I've been in prison for 20 years. Like I want to cuddle. But it turned out to be better because I think we were very kind of like self-effacing, or we like kind of sold the worst version of ourselves. Like we emphasized our fault and minimized our kind of qualities. And what ended up happening is her positive qualities are much more than she sold them to be, and her faults are much less. So I was expecting worse, and I get better. And I think by doing that, you end up with a much better satisfaction. Seriously, because other people are like catfishing people and being like, I'm great all the time. And then they have one bad day and you're disappointed when she's like, look, there's some stuff you got to know. Well, all of a sudden I'm ready for it. I'm not expecting something unrealistic. And then I'm even more satisfied when she ends up to be the person she is. I think it's a great way to go.
Yeah.
So it worked out for us. I wouldn't necessarily recommend reaching out to like just start a relationship with somebody in prison.
I think so many of the things though apply to relationships in general. I mean, it's just like, whether it's long distance, whether it's somebody you're meeting, I just think that level of communication and just trying to be so honest about yourself and watching what somebody does rather than what they say. I mean, those are the takeaways, whether it's a prison relationship, whether it's a regular relationship out in the world. Mm-hmm. I think those are things that have really helped us work.
Yeah, and hopefully it'll help you too. Thank you.